You might have noticed that this episode is starting from me at the rear of the car, and there's a very good reason for doing that. Today we are finally looking at the wiring. Now you might be wondering, when I've been doing an engine conversion with the engine in the front of the car, why I'm at the rear of the car looking at wiring. On a classic Mini, the battery is in the boot, and therein lies a problem. The Nissan Micro donor car that we're taking the engine and wiring room for is obviously configured to have a battery in the front. So we've got to get power from the battery here in the rear up to the engine bay and then tie the Nissan Micro wiring loom into that. First job, however, there is clear all the junk that I've been storing in the back of this car for the last year out of it.
With the boot clear, I fitted a brand new battery to the Mini. My plan had been to use the battery out of the Micro donor car, however while it was narrow enough and short enough to fit the Mini's battery box, it was unfortunately too tall. I couldn't use the battery that was in the Mini as that unfortunately pretty much got killed while we were in Mongolia after the exhaust broke, shifted across, melted the battery cable and this shorted out the cable against the bodywork. This also happened to be the battery from one of my other cars. While getting the Mini ready for the Mongol Valley, I put a used battery in that I'd had. 4 days before setting off, this died, and so in desperation I stole the battery from my daily drive.
So now we've got the battery in place, we can start look at running the power feeds to the engine bay. First thing we're going to do though is make a new earth strap. As I said, both that and the main power wire do need to be replaced. The Mini's earth strap bolts into a position here. This age Mini is the standard negative earth, so that's not going to give us any problems. So what we need to do is create a short lead that goes from this point here to a battery terminal there. Now I'm going to replace the battery terminals with these fellas that I bought for a couple of reasons. The original one just kind of push on and hold on with friction. Many years ago I hit a bump once a bit quick coming home from work at about 10 o'clock at night, and that dislodged my battery cable, so my engine died and all my lights went off. I'd really like to avoid that again if I could. So these ones clamp on properly and give us a nice point to bolt a spade connector onto. So let's get this fitted and then measure up for the cable. With one end already crimped onto the cable, I could bolt it to the floor and measure up the length to see how long the earth strap needed to be. Typical memory card filled up as I was making that, but it's only a basic crimp and a bit of heat shrink. I'm fairly sure you can probably all figure out how it's done. So we can now fit this to the car. With the earth strap bolted in place, I can move on to the second reason why I chose to use these terminal clamps. So this is the battery positive terminal. I've already stripped off the red casing temporarily. What we need to do is mount the Q fuse to it, followed by the terminal that will be on the end of the battery hot lead, followed by an isolating washer, and then the retaining nut. The only issue I've got is a standard little stud that came in that terminal is a bit short, so we need to make a long one. can now fit the positive battery terminal that we just made and start running the cable.
Now I have debated a bit on where I was going to run this cable, but in the end I decided the easiest way was just to run it in a factory location. So that, the Mini, is underneath here. I do hope my exhaust is far enough away from it this time.
The addition of a Q fuse on the positive battery terminal means that in the event that the battery cable does get damaged and shorts out against the bodywork, the fuse will blow rather than the cable melting again and potentially causing a fire. If you've never used one of these hydraulic crimpers, I have to say they've got a really satisfying feeling to them. It's a bit like the click of a torque wrench, fresh bed sheet, and other things I'm not allowed to discuss on YouTube. And with the crimp terminal crimped and the heat shrunk, the cable just needed routing back through the engine bay and connecting to the starter motor. Now we've got power run up to the starter motor, which we can tap into to power the rest of the electronics, we can start looking at the rest of the wiring loom. Now believe it or not, this is not the entirety of a Nissan Micro's wiring loom. This has been largely thinned down. About 18 months ago, some wonderful contractor just outside where I live, and I think dug through a major fibre optic cable and took out the internet. We were all forced to work at home at the time, I couldn't continue working, and so my employer very kindly gave me the afternoon off. I put it to good use, stripping this down. Now, wiring might seem daunting, but this loom is about 3 put together. There's another one that I've got on my shelf that's going to go into this car, 2 more in the car that we don't need. So let's take this one step at a time, starting with engine loom. Now, as we haven't really changed any sensors on the engine, this wiring loom should pretty much be correct. The only thing we have done is slightly move the throttle body, and I've also utilised some of the mounting bracket holes that to bolt other things into, so we're probably going to have to adjust them, and we might have to just tweak a few cable lengths. But let's get this in place, because this is going to largely determine where the ECU can go. After initial test fit of the engine harness, I found that a bracket didn't quite fit, and I couldn't get the plugs onto 2 of the injectors. The first problem was solved quite easily by cutting the corner off the bracket. The second was a little bit more complicated and required me modifying the injector retaining plate so that the injectors could be rotated a bit, allowing the connectors to go on. Fortunately, the injectors are top feed, so I could get away with rotating them. While I've had this loom on the car, it's become blindingly apparent that some of my wiring to the throttle body is nowhere near close to the position. It needs to be further back down this way of the loom. Fortunately, as I say, the way that this is in the car, I can unravel this peel and back. If the loom came in from the other side, nah, that would cause a problem. So, let's break out the Stanley knife. With the injector rail modified and the cable lengths to the sensors on the throttle body sorted out, it was just a case of refitting the loom. Now that the engine harness is in position and all connected up, we can start looking at the power distribution side of things. Now, I plan to use the Micro's fuse block because this has enough fuse positions that can support everything that the engine requires, plus what the rest of the Mini requires. The Mini fuse panel is the old-fashioned glass type fuses, and while they do a perfectly good job, the fuse block that's in there isn't in particularly good condition. I have planned on replacing it with a standard replacement item version, but I'd rather just keep to one style of fuses in the Mini. Now, I've already partly stripped this and taken a lot of the wires out, but there is still a little bit more to go. I've got the good old Haynes manual with the wiring diagrams I can refer to, so yeah, let's thin this out and then we can look at mounting this into the car. Disregard what I just said because there's been a slight change of plan. While picking through the power distribution loom, I eventually got to a point where I had to reference this loom, which lives behind the back of the Micro's dashboard, in order to figure out where some connections went. While going through this loom, this inevitably led me to this, which is a fuse panel that lives in the Micro's driver's footwell. Now, after a lot of head scratching and finding diagrams and referencing my Haynes manual and checking out another Nissan Micra, I've been able to thin this down to 3 relays, 3 that are there, and 1 that's on a plug still in the loom, and all of 7 fuses. The reason I'm bringing this up and the reason of the change of plan is because instead of having 2 partial fuse boxes, I am able to now combine everything into one. Fortunately, there are enough spare fuse holders in this to replace the ones that are in there, and the relay box also has enough spare slots to fit the relays into. This is going to make hopefully things when I install it into the Mini a lot easier, because I'm only going to have hopefully 2 looms, not 3 looms that I have to run through the bulkhead. So, now watch me have to figure out how to transfer everything from one end of a loom into here and condense this down, while also not messing up anything that has got to remain in this loom and connect into the ECU. This is going to be tricky. I will save you from watching what is probably days worth of work spread over various evenings, weekends and lunch breaks modifying this loom. What I will tell you, however, is that A, it's possible, B, it's seriously tedious, C, requires a considerable use of a multimeter, de-pinning tool, pliers and crimpers, D, requires a fair amount of patience, E, that the Haynes manual wiring diagram does not show all wires, so you're going to have to figure a lot of it out yourself, and F, requires an awful lot of labelling and note taking. With that being said, we can now look at how we're going to mount this lot into the car. Now, I've stood around and moved things around a bit and tried to get things into position. Obviously, when I get the relay box and a fuse box in place, I want them in a position where I can take the lids off and change a fuse. I don't want to have to go and bolting half a dozen things to get a lid off to swap a fuse if unfortunately I pop one. What I also have to consider is somewhere in this area I have to get in the washer bottle, because this Micra engine doesn't give you space where it's supposed to live on the driver's wing. I think roughly the layout is going to be something like that, which isn't too dissimilar actually to how it was on the Micro, albeit spun around by 180 degrees. And I think I'll make this bracket pick up off this very rusty plate that sits underneath here. And I also want to change this so this pipe outlet comes out slightly further over to the driver's side. So first job, let's get this plate out, and then let's crack out some cardboard and start designing this bracket. With the cardboard template made, it was just the usual process of marking around it onto some steel and cutting it out. And finally, I welded some captive nuts to the plate. If you've ever fitted or removed one of the original bulkhead plates while the windscreen is in place, you will know what a pain in the ass it is to do. These captive nuts are going to make that job considerably easier. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click that like button and share. If you want to keep up to date on the build, please subscribe, and you can follow my build thread on the mini forum. The link is in the description below. Once again, thanks for watching.